Poor girl got soaked in the rain, until a stranger with a limo offered her a ride. And what happened next? You won't believe how this night ended. Tell us where you're watching from in the comments. What country do you live in? Now here's how it all began. The rain wasn't gentle that evening. It came down in sheets, hammering the sidewalks and drenching everything in its path. Mia stood at the edge of the crosswalk, her arms wrapped tightly around a paper bag filled with groceries. With every drop, her coat grew heavier and her shoes made that awful squelching sound with each step. Her umbrella had snapped earlier that day, so all she had left was her hood, barely clinging to her damp hair. She spotted a coffee shop glowing warmly on the corner and rushed toward it, hoping for a place to sit and dry off. But as she reached for the handle, a barista locked the door from inside and shook his head with a shrug. Closed. She stood there, dripping, watching people inside sip lattes and laugh under the safe hum of heaters. Cars whizzed by, sending cold waves from puddles up her legs. She took a deep breath and stepped back toward the sidewalk, heart sinking deeper with each second. Then, without warning, a long black limousine slowed down beside her. It didn't honk, it didn't roar. It moved with quiet authority, its sleek body reflecting the neon lights of the street. The back window rolled down halfway. Mia, startled, looked up. A man in a charcoal suit sat inside. His tie was neatly pinned, his expression unreadable, except for his eyes. They were kind. He studied her for a moment, then asked with surprising gentleness, "Do you need a ride somewhere?" She didn't answer right away. Part of her wanted to run, to say no, to avoid appearing weak or desperate, but her fingers were numb, her legs were trembling, and no one else had even noticed her. And that car. It was warm, dry, and waiting. Would you have gotten in? Mia hesitated, her fingers tightening around the soaked paper bag in her arms. The rain hadn't let up. It was only growing heavier, falling like it had a personal vendetta against the city. The limo's open window still waited, and behind it, the man's calm, almost curious expression didn't flinch. He didn't pressure her. He didn't repeat the question. He simply watched her, as if he knew she was balancing a storm inside her head far worse than the one above them. Her instincts fought each other. One warned her to stay away, he was a stranger after all. But the other voice, deeper and quieter, whispered that sometimes, not everyone who shows up out of nowhere is a threat. Sometimes help comes in unexpected forms. Finally she nodded, barely but enough. The rear door opened with a soft click and she slid inside, careful not to drip too much on the leather seats. It was warm, the kind of warmth that felt like safety. Her whole body seemed to sigh in relief. "I'm Ethan," the man said as the door shut and the car pulled away from the curb. "You looked like you needed a bit of shelter from the storm." Mia gave a small, tired smile. "I'm Mia, and thank you. I wasn't sure if I should." He raised an eyebrow, amused. "Still not sure." "I'm still wet," she laughed softly, brushing wet strands of hair from her face. "But I think this beats standing in the gutter." The driver, dressed in a crisp uniform, glanced briefly in the mirror but said nothing. It was all so surreal, like Mia had stepped out of her life and into someone else's for a moment. The seats were stitched with detail, and the faint scent of cologne and leather lingered in the air. A small screen in front played soft jazz, and there was even a tray with bottled water and hand towels. She glanced sideways at Ethan. His jawline was sharp, his eyes focused, not on his phone, not on any distraction, but on her. Like he was genuinely present. She hadn't felt looked at that way in a long time. Not since her father passed. Not since life became a series of shifts, bills, and quiet dinners alone. "Where should I drop you off?" he asked, still gentle. And that question, so simple, so polite, hit harder than she expected. Because she didn't know anymore, not where she was going, not where she wanted to be. She took a breath, then whispered, "Anywhere dry." "That's enough for tonight." The limo glided through the soaked city streets like a ghost ship, its tires slicing clean lines in puddles that mirrored the blur of neon lights. Inside, silence filled the space between Mia and Ethan, not the awkward kind, but the kind that asked permission to settle. It was the first time all day she didn't feel the need to explain herself, defend her choices, or apologize for her exhaustion. She leaned her head lightly against the window, watching raindrops race each other down the glass, their trails illuminated by headlights and street lamps. Ethan didn't push. He didn't pepper her with questions, offer unsolicited advice, or perform the usual polite small talk. He simply sat, fingers loosely intertwined, watching the world pass by with a calm she found strangely comforting. She stole a glance at him, a man in a perfectly tailored coat, a wristwatch that probably cost more than her rent, and a posture that said he was used to being in control. But something in his stillness hinted at restraint, not arrogance, not judgment, just observation. "Are you always this quiet?" she asked suddenly, her voice soft. He smiled faintly. "Only when I don't want to scare someone off." Mia looked away, a smirk pulling at the corner of her lips. "You think I scare easy?" "No," he replied, his tone thoughtful. "I think you're used to fighting alone." That pulled her eyes back to him. She wanted to ask how he could possibly know that, but the words caught in her throat. Maybe it was written all over her, the heavy coat soaked through, the cheap shoes ruined by water, the paper grocery bag that had collapsed under the weight of too many invisible burdens. The car slowed slightly as it neared a quieter part of town. She recognized the street, a few blocks from her apartment. She could have asked to be let off, ended the strange, oddly tender encounter. But she didn't speak. Not yet. "Do you always pick up strangers in the rain?" she asked instead, needing to break the intensity of his gaze. Ethan chuckled once, a low, real sound. "No, but something about the way you didn't ask for help made it hard to drive away." And there it was again, that pull. The way he noticed things without making them uncomfortable. The way he saw her, not just her soaked clothes or tired eyes, but something underneath. Mia sat back in the seat, heart beating a little faster now. She wasn't sure what this was. She wasn't sure she trusted it. But for the first time in weeks, maybe even months, she didn't feel invisible. She didn't feel alone. When the limo came to a gentle stop at the edge of her street, Mia hesitated. The rain had eased to a drizzle, but her neighborhood still looked bleak under the washed-out glow of the streetlights. Sidewalks cracked, faded paint on old bricks, a flickering bulb above a corner store where time seemed stuck. It wasn't a place you brought someone like him. But Ethan didn't flinch. He leaned forward, glancing out the window without judgment, as if this too was just part of a larger story he was willing to hear. "You can drop me here," she said quietly, reaching for the door handle. "It's just a short walk." "Or," he replied calmly, "I can walk you to your door and make sure you're safe." She paused, hand on the latch. No one ever offered to walk her to her door. People passed by her building like it didn't exist. She didn't know if it was pride or fear that made her hesitate, but something deeper told her this moment mattered. She nodded once, then stepped out, boots splashing in the shallow water pooled at the curb. As they walked, silence trailed behind them. Her building was 3 flights up, no elevator, and the hallway lights flickered like they hadn't been replaced in years. She hated this part, bringing someone into her real world, not the version she wore to interviews or held together in passing conversations, but the one where her mother coughed through the night in the bedroom next door, where the wallpaper peeled at the edges, and rent notices came more often than birthday cards. They stopped at her door and she turned to face him. "Thanks," she said, voice softer than before, "for everything." Ethan tilted his head. "You don't owe me anything." Her smile was tired. "I know. But still, it's been a long time since someone noticed." He seemed like he wanted to say something more, something that didn't belong in a hallway that smelled like damp wood and old lives. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled out a card. "If you ever need anything," he said, holding it out, "even if it's just another ride." She looked at the card in her hand. Minimal design, heavy paper. His name in elegant font, Ethan Calloway. Her eyes lingered on it for a moment before she tucked it into her coat pocket. As she opened the door, she caught his gaze one last time, and in that moment, amid peeling paint and broken lights, she saw no pity in his expression, only interest, curiosity, something unspoken that neither of them was quite ready to name. She stepped inside, closed the door behind her, and leaned against it for a breath. The card was still warm in her pocket. Mia thought about throwing the card away at least 5 times that week. Each time she reached into her coat pocket, her fingers brushed against its smooth edges, and each time she hesitated. She didn't belong in the world his name came from. Whatever life Ethan Calloway led was galaxies away from grocery store coupons and overdue rent. But she didn't throw it away. She told herself she wouldn't call, that it would seem desperate, that he probably handed that same card to dozens of people, that the night in the limo had been a fluke, a passing gesture from a man who probably forgot her name the moment he drove away. But somehow she couldn't believe that, not entirely. Her days returned to their routine, early mornings, a cafe shift that paid more in blisters than bills, and evenings filled with the quiet ache of a home too tired to hope. She tried to ignore the hum inside her that said something had shifted. But it showed up anyway, in how she checked her reflection in windows or how she slowed down at the intersection where the limo had stopped. And then came Friday. She was wiping down tables when the doorbell above the cafe jingled. She looked up, not expecting much, but then she froze. Ethan was standing at the entrance. He wasn't in a suit this time. His coat was open, scarf loosely hanging, and he looked slightly windblown, like he hadn't intended to walk in but did anyway. Their eyes locked. He smiled. "I was nearby," he said, walking in like they'd known each other longer than just one rain-soaked evening. "Thought I'd see if you ever used that card." Mia blinked, hands still gripping the dishcloth. "I didn't." "I know," he said, glancing at the pocket where the card would be. "But I had a feeling you still had it." She looked down, flushed. "You came all this way to check?" "I came because I wanted to." Then, after a pause, "I've had worse coffee in fancier places, but none that I remembered." She shook her head, half laughing, half stunned. "You really don't get how weird this is, do you?" "I do," he said gently, "but maybe that's why it matters." Her manager eyed them from behind the counter, and Mia knew she'd catch heat later. But for the first time in days, she didn't care. She gestured toward a table by the window. "Sit. I'll bring you the best we've got," which is saying almost nothing. He smiled wider. "I'm here for the company, not the coffee." As she turned to pour the cup, her hands trembled slightly. Not from nerves, but from something deeper, like the moment you realize a page has turned in your life, and even if you don't know what the next one says, you want to keep reading. Mia placed the chipped white mug in front of Ethan, the steam curling upward like an invitation she didn't know how to write. He watched her with quiet eyes, the kind that didn't scan the room for something better, the kind that settled and stayed. It made her uneasy, but not in a way she wanted to escape, in a way that made her forget to breathe. He took a sip and winced. "Still the worst coffee I've ever had." "Good," she replied, arms crossed, half smirking. "Means it's honest." They talked. About nothing at first. Weather, neighborhood noise, the kind of silence that lived between people who didn't know how to explain why they felt familiar. But then, something shifted. He asked about the books stacked behind the counter. She asked why someone like him would ever walk into a place like this twice. "I grew up 2 blocks from here," he said. "My mum used to bring me in for muffins when we couldn't afford more. This place, your place, it reminds me of her." Mia blinked. "You don't seem like someone who comes from 2 blocks from here." He smiled softly. "Most people don't." And that's when it happened. That soft cracking sound inside her. Where a wall had been, now there was light. She didn't know who Ethan Calloway really was, not yet, but something told her he knew what it meant to miss things, to hunger for warmth in places where it rarely arrived. A customer called her name, breaking the moment. She stood quickly, too quickly, and knocked over the sugar jar. Ethan reached to steady it before it shattered. Their hands touched, just for a second. But in that second, the world did something it rarely does. It paused. The rain outside, the chatter, the ding of the register, all faded. And there they were. 2 strangers who somehow didn't feel like strangers at all. She cleared her throat. "I should get back to work," he nodded. "I'll be here. No rush." And as she walked away, her fingers still tingled from the contact, from the idea that maybe kindness wasn't always random. Maybe sometimes kindness parked its car in the rain and came back a week later, just to see if you'd remember the feeling. When Mia stepped into the kitchen to grab a tray of scones, she heard them. Two servers, both barely out of college, giggling near the back sink. That's him, right? The guy with the limo? Why would he come back for her? She probably begged for attention, or worse. Their laughter stung more than she expected. She didn't move, didn't breathe, just stood there with her hand on the tray, like it was the only thing holding her upright. The words weren't new. People had always assumed the worst when something good brushed against her life, but it still hurt, it always did. When she returned to the front, Ethan looked up with a kind of calm that made the world feel less sharp. But she noticed it now, how other customers were looking too, like they were piecing together some scandal, like her life had suddenly become entertainment. She avoided Ethan's eyes as she placed his check on the table, even though she knew he wouldn't be paying yet. "Thanks for stopping by," she said, her voice flatter than she intended. "You're kicking me out already?" he asked, playful but perceptive. She trailed off, then took a deep breath. "It's better if you don't come back." He didn't move, didn't frown, just tilted his head slightly, studying her. "Because of what people are saying?" She looked away. "Because I've worked hard for this cafe. I don't want anyone thinking I traded dignity for a customer's affection." He nodded slowly. "Then let me make something clear, Mia. I didn't come here to rescue you. I came back because you reminded me what it's like to be real. And I'm not ready to forget that." A silence settled between them, thicker than steam, heavier than judgment. She didn't answer. She couldn't. Instead, she turned and walked back toward the counter, but her hand trembled as she reached for a clean cup, because sometimes the hardest thing isn't surviving a storm, it's convincing yourself you deserve sunshine when it finally comes. The next morning, Mia left her apartment earlier than usual, her coat pulled tight around her against the biting wind. She didn't want to run into Ethan again. She thought putting distance between them would quiet the noise in her head, but her chest still felt heavy with everything she hadn't said. She reached the corner where the bus usually picked her up and stopped short. Parked along the curb wasn't a bus. It was the same sleek black limo. Ethan was outside it this time, standing by the door in a dark coat, hands tucked in his pockets. He looked like he'd been waiting a while, and not because he had to. She froze. "You shouldn't be here." "I know," he said, stepping closer, "but I figured if you're going to run from me, at least let me drive you where you're headed." Mia almost laughed, but it caught in her throat. "Why are you doing this?" Ethan exhaled. "Because I've spent years surrounded by people who only show up when the cameras are rolling or the contracts are ready. But you—" He paused, searching for the words. "You didn't ask for anything. You didn't even want the ride. And I can't stop thinking about how it felt to sit across from you and talk like the world wasn't trying to sell me something." She looked at the open car door behind him, then back at the man who had disrupted her entire idea of how kindness should look. Her gut told her to say no, to protect the fragile independence she'd worked so hard to keep intact. But her heart whispered something else. Mia stepped past him, climbed into the limo, and sat down without a word. Ethan followed silently, and as the door clicked shut behind them, the city noise faded. For the first time in a long while, so did the noise inside her. They didn't talk much on the drive, but in that quiet space, something unspoken passed between them. It wasn't charity, it wasn't obligation. It was something far more rare, understanding. The car rolled through the city in silence, the kind of silence that didn't need to be filled. Ethan sat across from Mia, watching her as the light filtered through the tinted windows and brushed gently against her face. She didn't shrink away from his gaze anymore, but she didn't meet it either. She was deep in her own thoughts, hands resting on the frayed strap of her bag. At one point, Ethan reached into the small compartment beside him and handed her something carefully wrapped in a napkin. Inside was a warm croissant. "It's from this little place my mom used to take me," he said. "She swore it could fix anything." Mia blinked, caught off guard by the gesture more than the pastry. She took it with a quiet thank you, then bit in slowly. It was still warm, flaky, and somehow comforting. As they passed her old neighborhood, she tapped the glass once. "Can we stop here?" Ethan nodded. The car pulled over by a graffiti-tagged brick building that had long since lost its shine. Mia stepped out and stood in front of the stoop. "This is where I grew up. My dad left before I could walk. My mom worked 3 jobs and still had to choose between food and rent sometimes. Ethan stepped out beside her, hands in his coat again. He didn't say a word. I used to think that if I worked hard enough, life would stop kicking me down, she continued. But life doesn't really work like that, does it? No, he said softly. It doesn't. But sometimes someone shows up who's willing to walk through the wreckage with you. Mia looked at him then, not just glanced, but truly looked, and something in her face shifted. The weight she carried seemed to lighten just slightly, as though the past wasn't pressing quite so hard on her chest. She sighed, half a laugh, half a breath. You know, it's strange. I've spent my whole life being invisible. Then one storm, one stupid bag of groceries, and suddenly, someone sees me. Ethan stepped closer. I don't just see you, Mia. I admire you, your strength, your fire. None of this has changed you. It's sharpened you. For a moment, she couldn't speak. Then she looked away, blinking quickly. I'm not used to people saying things like that. Most of them only notice when I'm gone. Then maybe it's time someone stayed, he said quietly. And in that moment, surrounded by a neighborhood that once held her pain, Mia realized that maybe the rain hadn't ruined everything. Maybe, just maybe, it had washed something new into her life. That evening, as the clouds returned and the wind began to pick up, Ethan didn't ask questions. He simply walked beside Mia, holding an umbrella above them both as they made their way through her old neighborhood. They didn't talk much. Words weren't needed. The silence between them was no longer awkward. It had become a kind of understanding. He stopped at a corner store and stepped inside without explanation. When he came out, he was holding a small second-hand umbrella, the kind with frayed edges and a faded pattern of daisies. He handed it to her with a shrug. This one's for when I'm not around. Mia laughed quietly, surprised by how warm that simple gesture made her feel. She didn't know what to say, so she tucked the umbrella under her arm and kept walking, now closer to him than before. They arrived at her apartment just as the rain started again. It wasn't the violent downpour from the night before. This time it was soft and steady, like the sky had calmed down, like it was ready to listen. "Do you want to come in?" she asked, unlocking her door. Ethan looked up at the building, then back at her. "Only if you want me to." She paused, then opened the door wider. "I do." Inside, her apartment still looked modest. Worn-out furniture, walls that needed repainting, and a single potted plant trying its best to survive on the windowsill. But there was a quiet charm to it, and Ethan noticed how carefully everything was kept, how it reflected her strength. She made tea. He wandered around, stopping at a small photo on the bookshelf, Mia and her mother both smiling, wind in their hair. He didn't ask questions. He simply nodded and said she'd be proud. Mia sat across from him on the small couch, legs tucked under her. The tea steamed between them, and for a moment they didn't drink. They just sat, letting the stillness settle like dust in the quiet. "You didn't have to stop yesterday," she said finally. "Most people wouldn't have." "I didn't stop because I had to," he replied. "I stopped because I saw someone I couldn't ignore." She stared into her mug, the hint of a smile tugging at her lips. That someone was me. That someone still is. Outside, the rain pattered gently on the glass. Inside, something softer began to bloom. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was something close, something real, something built not on grand gestures, but on slow, steady presence. And for the first time in a long time, Mia felt like she wasn't standing in the storm alone. The next morning, sunlight peeked through the curtain cracks, casting a golden haze across Mia's living room. Ethan was already gone, but not without leaving signs of care. The extra umbrella rested neatly by the door, and a note lay on the coffee table in his unmistakably tidy handwriting. "For whatever tomorrow brings, E." She held the note for a long time before setting it aside and going about her day. There were groceries to buy, laundry to wash, emails to send. Life didn't pause just because someone kind had entered it, but the way she moved was different now. Lighter, like she wasn't dragging the weight of silence behind her anymore. Later that day, she stepped into her favorite local bookstore, the kind with uneven shelves and cats that slept in the philosophy section, and there he was, Ethan, sitting cross-legged on the floor in the non-fiction aisle, flipping through a book about social entrepreneurship. When he looked up and saw her, he didn't jump to his feet or say anything poetic. He just smiled, warm and real, like he'd been waiting for her without needing to say so. "I thought you had a jet to catch," she said, raising an eyebrow. He closed the book, stood and dusted off his pants. "I cancelled it." Her breath caught a little. "Why?" Ethan tilted his head. "Because yesterday felt more important than wherever I was supposed to go." They walked out together, arm in arm, not needing to speak as much now. The connection between them had shifted, no longer held together by circumstance, but by choice. At the corner where they had first crossed paths, it started to rain again. Light and playful this time, a gentle reminder rather than a threat. People ran for shelter. Cars honked and hurried. But Mia stood still. "This is where you stopped your car," she said quietly. He looked around, then nodded. "And saw you." Mia reached into her bag and pulled out the daisy umbrella. "Then I guess we owe the rain a thank you." He laughed. "Let's not test it too much." Still, they stood there in the drizzle for a moment longer, not because they had to, but because they could. And as droplets soaked the edges of her sleeves and glistened in his hair, Mia realized something simple and strange. She was exactly where she was supposed to be. The rain began to fall harder, but neither Mia nor Ethan moved. They stood at that same intersection where their paths had first crossed, only now it wasn't fate or chance holding them there. It was choice, deliberate, grounded, real. "I never asked," he said, glancing sideways. "But that night, where were you going before I stopped?" Mia looked down, raindrops racing each other off her lashes. "Nowhere important. I was coming back from a job interview, one I didn't get. I was soaked, cold, rejected, and trying not to cry in public." Ethan's brow furrowed, and no one stopped. "Plenty of people stared," she said with a faint, hollow laugh. "But you were the only one who did anything." There was a long silence then, broken only by the rhythm of raindrops on pavement and the muted roar of the city behind them. Ethan finally reached into his coat pocket and pulled something out. Small, square, velvet. Mia's heart stopped. "You know," he said softly, "I've had this with me since the day after I met you. But I didn't want you to think it was about gratitude or sympathy. I wanted it to be about something more." He opened the box. Inside was a delicate ring, gold band, no diamonds, just a single sapphire, the color of a rainy evening sky. "Mia," he said, stepping closer, his voice steady despite the tremble in his fingers. "Will you make sure I never drive past another broken moment without stopping?" She blinked, stunned, her hands clutched to her chest. "You're proposing. In the rain, where it started, and where I hope it never ends." She didn't say anything for a moment. She looked up at him, soaked hair clinging to her cheeks, eyes shining with more than water. Then she nodded. "I will. I do. I always would have." They kissed under the streetlight as the world spun around them. Cars passed, umbrellas opened, people rushed past. But for a moment they stood still in the chaos, as if the city had paused just long enough for their story to find its ending. Months later, their wedding wasn't some extravagant ballroom affair. It was held on a rooftop, with string lights swaying in the wind, daisy umbrellas at every seat in memory of that day. Mia wore a simple white dress, Ethan a charcoal suit, and as she walked down the aisle it began to drizzle, soft silver rain that danced on the petals of the flowers she once sold. The guests cheered. Ethan couldn't take his eyes off her, and when the vows were said and the kiss sealed the promise, a rainbow curved over the city skyline behind them, as if even the sky approved. Sometimes the smallest gestures, a car stopping, a hand reaching out, a shared umbrella, can echo through a lifetime. Because love doesn't always arrive with fanfare. Sometimes it pulls over quietly on the side of the road, opens the door and says, "You don't have to walk alone anymore." If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, comment your favorite moment, and subscribe for more stories that prove real love still exists in the most unexpected places. Let's share the rain and the hope with the world.